Welcome to another installment of our town hall meetings here on November 10th. It's an opportunity to come together again to hear the voice of the community, to see where we are in our society, especially this evening talking and speaking about our children. What is it about our children that sort of bring us to fight a little harder or cry a little bit more or try to gather us together in discerning how can we help that generation to become the next generation, to become the next generation? It's the gift of life that continues to grow, and yet we have some responsibility in there, and we're here to talk a little bit about that in a way of how we as church, how we as society, as neighborhoods, can bring about a greater hope and understanding for our children. So we ask that we take a moment in prayer this evening, acknowledging that as we do know God's grace is with us, we also know that God's grace works through us and among us, pulling us together as people of God on that same mission to help those who are most in need of our love and help, but also most in need to help themselves, to grow in faith, to grow as a community of love and compassion. So we ask our God to bless and gift us this evening, that our discussion may open our hearts and souls to the challenges in our society, to the way in which our society is growing into the future from generation to generation, but also acknowledging that we really do need the help of a loving Savior, a loving God who can guide us on our journey. So open our eyes, God, open our hearts, open our souls, that we may know your way and your peace on this journey. So we take a moment and ask for our next speaker to come up. Sheila, if you'd like to present that which happens next.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Sheila Deluca and part of the planning team for our town hall meetings. Happy to be here with you all this evening. All of those listening online, welcome. So when the group gathered to plan for this year, we decided on the Catholic social teachings as our focus for the whole year. And for tonight, it was to focus on the teaching of option for the poor and vulnerable. And as we thought about that, we wanted somebody that had a heart for how poverty affects families. We wanted someone with experience in our community and had a feel for what was going on. And we wanted somebody that had vision. And our first choice was Dave Pietenpol. And lucky for us, he's available. He said yes. Dave has been involved with the Ecumenical Partnership for Housing, something that our parish, Resurrection Parish, has been part of since its beginning. And Dave has been part of it for 17 years in many roles, including executive director and as board president. In fact, he's currently serving EPH on the board and as interim executive director until a new one is hired. He's also currently on the board of directors for St. John's Ministries here in Green Bay, and he's the board president. So you can see why we're glad that he said yes to tonight. His title is Our Kids, the American Dream in Crisis. Please help me welcome Dave Pietenpol.
Thank you, Sheila. I appreciate it. Glad to be here this evening, and for those of you who are on live stream as well. The first thing I'd like to do, though, is just thank you, members of Resurrection, for your generosity in helping start EPH and your generosity over many, many years. And especially a little bit of a shout out to both Kitty and Karen. Kitty as board member and Karen as having been a unit coordinator for so many years. So again, you have been a very good, very generous parish, and I thank you for that. The first thing we're going to do is start with a short video. This is a video about a wonderful young lady by the name of Callie, who went through transitional housing and then came into and is now part of EPH's long-term supportive housing program. And in this video, Callie shares a little bit about her journey and then what our partnership has meant to her. So with that, should we roll the video?
What I really needed was just somebody to give me a chance so that I could prove not only to them that I wouldn't let them down, to myself and to my kids. I'm very blessed that EPH gave me the chance. I have 2 boys, a 6-year-old and an almost 1-year-old, and then I have 2 daughters, a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old. I was living in my car for about 7 months. I was pregnant, and I did give birth while I was homeless still. It was scary, but I felt that it was safer than the situation that I was in before. I'd rather be in a small car with the kids in a parking lot than I did in the house that I was living in. It was terrifying living hour by hour every day, not knowing what could or would happen next. How am I going to bathe my kids to go to daycare? How are they going to not know that they weren't just sleeping in a parking lot all night? How am I going to be able to go to work if I can't even take a shower? I haven't eaten in 2 days. It was awful. Having to worry every night, like, where am I going to sleep or what am I going to do tomorrow? Then I was in a transitional living program for a year. This is good for now, but then where am I going to go after this? I found out about EPH through the transitional living program, and then I moved into my house. I remember when I brought the kids to show them, they cried, especially the oldest. She loves her room and everything she has in there, and she always says she never wants to leave, and she's always at school drawing pictures of her house, and she's excited to let people know that she has her own house. I would say our life has definitely changed because of where we are living. We're able to set routines and go to bed at the same time every night, eat dinner together every night. Everybody's just relaxed and calm. When I moved into my home, I didn't really have anything because I started from my car, and then EPH gave me a chance. They don't just put you in a house and then turn their back on you. They're there for you no matter what does happen. My kids were all able to have their first birthday parties that they've ever had. I learned a lot about myself, and the directions I was going before is not who I wanted to be. Where I am now is what I've always dreamed about. It's good knowing that you have somebody that does push you forward and does have your back. You can do things, and it's not worth giving up on yourself or your children because of a situation you've gone through. Now I feel like I'm able to be a better person and a better mother to my children because we're in a better situation altogether.
So that's Callie. One of the opportunities available to Callie, if she wants, within our long-term supportive housing program, as she continues to prosper in this home, if she gets to the point where she says, you know, I really like this home, I like living here, we work with her to be able to purchase that home from us. So this can be Callie's forever home if she wants to. Just maybe a couple other little comments about the video. What you saw is Callie. That is truly Callie. However, she was really concerned about the privacy and the confidentiality and issues with her children. And so in this case, the kids are kind of stand-ins. They aren't her real kids. So giving her credit in some ways as a mom for the way she looks out for and takes care of her kids. So we'll weave through the talk today some other aspects, facts, examples related to EPH. And much of what I've learned over the last 15, 20 years about this topic has come from my involvement with EPH, with St. John's, other organizations within the community. EPH's focus is on families who are experiencing or at risk of homelessness within our community. So again, thank you, Resurrection Parish, for being able to support someone like Callie through their journey. So the presentation for this evening is is taking little bits and pieces out of the book, Our Kids, the American Dream in Crisis. That's where I kind of borrowed the title for today. And again, I'll weave in some EPH experiences with some of the comments from the author. If we can move to the next slide then, please. An alternate title for the presentation could have been Pull Yourself Up by the Bootstraps, Myth or Matter of Fact. I did a little research, and this expression originated back in the 1800s. And what it referred to is a person's ability to actually pick themselves up off the floor. So imagine having boots on with the straps like you can see in the picture. Put your fingers through the holes in the straps, now to pull yourself up off the ground. That is in reality about how hard it is to take yourself out of these kind of situations by yourself, out of poverty, out of homelessness, without help. It's like trying to pull yourself up by the bootstraps. And the reality is, barriers to social and economic opportunity make it nearly impossible for many families to pull yourself up. I'll introduce a book later on in the talk, and basically the premise of this book is that the United States really has become a caste society. We don't think of it that way, we don't talk about it that way. Instead, you hear about countries like India having a caste society. The reality is, the United States isn't much different. If you are in that lower socioeconomic group, it becomes very, very hard to escape that. Now, I'll digress just for a minute and come back to it later, because I want to introduce a little piece from Catholic Social Teachings. And I'll admit that having been a Methodist for the last 40 years, I'd not been introduced to Catholic Social Teachings until Sheila pointed me in that direction, and I very much appreciate it. So there are two words within the reading that I did that really, really resonated with me. And I'd even go as far as to say, if we could all, as a nation, go by those two words, it would really change our lives. So if we go to the next slide, please. Here's the quote. Those who are oppressed by poverty are the object of a preferential love by the church. And so the two words are preferential love. Now, what does that mean? So I thought about it personally. What does it mean to me? When I think of preferential love, I think of the love that is reserved kind of for my immediate family, you know, for my wife, my kids, my grandkids, okay? But what if we could all demonstrate preferential love for anybody else that is oppressed or experiencing poverty and homelessness? Imagine how things would change if we could come together and give them the same kind of love that we reserve for our family. So I'll talk about that again a little bit later, but going to the next slide, this is also talked about within Catholic Social Teachings and something that we talk about within EPH as well. This verse out of Matthew chapter 25, verse 40. Whatever you did for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. Or we could restate that just a little bit. Whatever you did for one of these, for someone oppressed by poverty, you did for me. Next several slides, thank you. The next several slides provide some information on why we have a socioeconomic gap within our country today, why it's actually a socioeconomic crisis. But I'd like to start out by saying that there are exceptions to that. And that's why, you know, I talk about the 80-80 rule. In other words, 80% of what I'll say applies 80% of the time. We can always find examples that are different or exceptions to many of these general findings and general rules. So the other thing I'd like to point out too is there's no intent to place blame for where we are today. There are no villains. We got here over the last 60 to 70 years to where we are today. So any solutions that we come up with may take another 20, 30, 40 years in order to get to where we are. But even though there are no villains, we can all be part of the solution. We can all provide that preferential love. Back in the 1950s and 60s, socioeconomic differences was not a constraint on opportunity. is not a constraint on opportunity. And this comes right out of our kids, The American Dream in Crisis, and I'll show you the author and everything later. But the author traces his research in parallels with his own life. And I can relate to a lot of what the author says as well. I grew up in the late 50s, early 60s, and so, while I was part of that, let's say in general, lower socioeconomic class, I did not experience any differences. As a kid, we went to the same school, we went to the same church, we played in the same sports teams. Those differences were pretty much oblivious to it. It really wasn't a barrier or constraint for us like it is today. I'm just going to grab a water here, if that's okay. Hope this wasn't yours, Father. So, what are some of the barriers to socioeconomic opportunity? And what we'll talk through are four or five of these areas: families, parenting, schooling, and community. We'll work our way through those a little bit at a time, and then we'll talk through and work through some solutions. Thank you, Tony. So starting with families, and I'd ask you to take a look at this slide, take a look at this table, the difference between middle socioeconomic and lower socioeconomic. Where do you fit within that? For lower socioeconomic, you can kind of read down the list. You have two parents, help with homework, meals at the table, and then you can contrast that with lower socioeconomic. Again, back then it wasn't much of a barrier like it is today. Just a couple of examples from some of our experiences within EPH. One of the things we try to do is get families to eat together at a table. That's something I grew up with. My kids grew up with it. Some of our best family stories come from sharing the conversations that we had at the dinner table. Yet for many kids, especially with a single-parent mom and working, being at a dinner table just doesn't take place. They just don't do that. In fact, one of the, how can I say this, one of the messiest places in homes that we find when we go in is actually in front of the couch, because that's where the kids sit to eat their dinner. Well, another example that's kind of similar to that is that related to communication is my wife and I were working with a family, single-parent mom, and we are trying to role model eating at the table. And so we did that, and we were close to dinner time, and I said to the kids, well, it's almost time to eat. Why don't you put the silverware around the table? They looked at me kind of oddly, and silverware? What's that? And so these kids grew up in a home that had never heard the word silverware. When I said knives and forks, oh yeah, that's good, I can do that. So now imagine those same kids being in a school system, well-behaved kids, but if they're missing the nuances of a word like silverware that many of us take for granted, imagine how many other words that they may be missing within that school, and then continuing to fall further and further behind their peers. So the importance of verbal interaction between parents and kids is absolutely critical. So let's go into that in a little bit more detail on verbal interactions. I apologize for the dry throat tonight. But if you're part of the middle class, a lot of your language, a lot of the words that you use is around encouragement and reasoning and answering why. Whereas with your lower class, it's mostly around rules and discipline. And sometimes that's just because that's what they have time for. An example that we experienced in terms of the use of words, especially when you're looking at generational families and generational poverty, we got a call from a neighbor once complaining that one of our families in my words, might have been outside trying to get her kids not to play in the street. But according to this neighbor, they would have used the words, this mom is out there yelling at her kids, using off-color language and at times racial overtones. So when we approached the family, when the case manager approached the family to talk about this, it was like, what are you talking about? This is just how we grew up. This is how we talked. So our middle-class social norms of language and behavior is just so different than what's often learned by people that are in that second and third generation of poverty. Again, coming back to the importance of time with mom and dad and words. If we can go on and talk about childhood development during the parenting process. How you parent impacts child development. Kids between the ages of 0 and 5, especially between 3 and 5, those are critical years for brain development. And the stress of poverty and homelessness impacts both parenting as well as that childhood development. Kids who experience long periods of severe or chronic stress are likely to have impaired problem skills in the ability to cope as they grow older. And when you don't have that opportunity for that brain development between 3 and 5, that is something you may never be able to recover from as a kid. And it leads to very much short-term thinking, which we'll get to in a second. But again, kids from an upper-class home hear 32 million more words by the time they enter kindergarten. So time with parents and then that language, that back and forth and learning is really a critical part of brain development. So going on to childhood development then, why is it that kids and young adults often make poor decisions, especially individuals that are experiencing homelessness or poverty? And I'll just read this second quote, but I think it's such an important and critical one. Early adverse experiences, trauma or stress, correlate with poor adult health, increased depression, drug abuse, poor job performance, social function, and impaired performance of subsequent generations. I'd like to read that again. Impaired performance of subsequent generations. That's one of the reasons I think we have a crisis on our hand. Let me just give you a couple examples of what we might call impaired decision-making, or a better way to say it might be examples where the very immediate need totally overrides any kind of longer-term thinking or taking into consideration the impact of what you're doing. Got a family. They needed to buy food. They needed to buy food today. So what they do, they ran and got a payday loan. So you know what payday loans will do to you. So what did they do when the payday loan came up? Well, what did they have that they could get rid of? So they took the family computer, they went to the pawn shop, pawned the computer in order to pay off part of the payday loan. And as you know, that doesn't pay for the whole thing. So eventually they had to come to EPH and get a bailout so we could kind of help them get back on track. But with the computer gone, now the kids no longer had access to a computer to do their homework. And so now the kids fall further behind. So you can see a pattern of a number of situations or examples where kids who are in that lower socioeconomic class or kids that are experiencing poverty really do start to have opportunity gaps compared to their middle class peers. All too often, decisions are made in the heat of the moment or the crisis of the day with little ability to process the implications of their decisions. And then that continues on well into adulthood as well. One other little piece that's really important too that I became more aware of more recently, and it has to do with childhood development again. It's a difference between middle class child care with working adults versus people in poverty. I'll just use my daughter and son-in-law as an example. I might use them a couple of times. Well, two working parents. They both had good jobs. They could afford child care. They went to an actual child care center. Many of the families that are in our EPH homes today, about 80% of them, their child care are friends, friends of his, friends of friends, or neighbors, or potentially even relatives. So they don't have the same kind of learning opportunities that you get in a daycare center. They don't have the same kind of safety that you have in a daycare center. The data points out that when you are with a friend, a relative, for one of those unlicensed, again, this is very much generality, you are much more subjective to verbal or physical abuse. And so again, those kids have fewer opportunities. Let's go into schooling for a little bit. Whom you go to school with matters a lot, more so than teachers or the school system. You may have heard comments, oh, we just need better teachers. The data says that's not true. It's the school system, it's who you go to school with that has the biggest difference. What they've done, some of the tests that they've done show that if you have a lower socioeconomic income school, which I can't say that too many times over the course of the evening, but if you have a school like that and you take kids out of a middle class school, put them into that, they go right down with the rest of the kids in that lower income school. Now, if you do the reverse, you take kids out of a lower socioeconomic income school, put them into a middle class school, and they prosper. They rise up to meet with all the rest of the kids that are in there. So where you go to school has a really big difference. I'll give another example related to schooling in a way that impacts the difference between lower and middle. Here I'll use my grandkids as an example again. COVID hits. Everybody's got to go to virtual learning. So what happens on our side? Well, Grandpa and Grandma, but primarily Grandma. Grandma goes over mornings, helps the kids get started, helps with the technology, helps make sure the laptops are connected to the school and everything else, and then guides the kids for weeks on end until it becomes routine and kids can do it on their own. Okay? But what do you do when you're a single mom, you're experiencing poverty, you're experiencing homelessness, you may not even understand technology enough to help your kids get connected, and now you got to run off to work, so now who's going to watch the kids? So you can see where this is going. So pretty soon the kids, and they may not even have internet access. I mean, we hear stories of kids who go to the library in order to try to do their schoolwork because they don't have it at home. So step by step, those kids fall further and further behind their middle class peers. Let's go on to community just for a second. I'll just hit a few pieces out of here. One of the big difference is informal mentors, or I could use the word positive role models. The research says that 2/3 of affluent children have mentoring or positive role models that extend beyond the family. 2/3 of poor kids do not. Middle class kids say most people can be trusted. Poor kids say you can't trust anyone, not even your own family. One of the things that we're experiencing more and more with EPH, especially over the last 3, 4, 5 years, is that, I'll contrast that to 7, 8 years ago. 7, 8 years ago, you might be able to go in and start the case management process fairly soon, relatively speaking. Now, you might spend the first month or two just trying to develop a relationship and trust with that family, because they have learned to be untrustful, so to speak, or not to trust folks. So that makes case management much more difficult today than what it was even years ago. The other thing I hear too, in fact, I received it in an email from a family just this week, asking for help, one of the EPH families. And within this email, the words that she used kind of, broke my heart in a way. She says, "I don't have anyone else." So think about all of us in the network that we have of friends and family that can help us. Yet for disrupted relationships, and both with extended family, I don't have anyone else. And what a barrier that becomes for the kids. Now add mental health related issues into it, and you can see what a difficult job that is, or a big impact that has on the kids. If I take the community piece just a step further, going into solutions for a second, it fits on the slide pretty well. One of the number one factors leading to resilience of a kid who's experiencing trauma is that of a positive, trusting role model in relationship. So, going on to, just in summary, we become more socioeconomically segregated. Lower economic status impacts family, impacts relationships, and impacts where you live, where you go to school, who you are associated with. Poverty, trauma, and subsequent stress impacts brain development and cognitive functioning. Again, I think that is really creating a crisis for us today. We are becoming more and more socioeconomically segregated. And the more we continue to be segregated, the larger the gap in knowledge, skills, decision-making capability, cognitive ability, and we create more and more of the poverty and homelessness that we're seeing today. It's a vicious cycle. Poverty drives family instability, which drives more poverty, which drives homelessness, and it's a cycle that's very, very difficult to get into. One of the things I want to do here, just for a second, is just do a kudos or a shout out to any teachers that we have in this group today or that we have in our community. Teachers are lifesavers for a lot of the kids that we're talking about. They may be the positive role model for a lot of the kids. The other thing I'll say too, if you are in doubt of anything that I've shared this evening, just go ask a teacher. They live this stuff day in and day out. They'll be able to give you examples of their own. So let's move into solutions then for a bit. But first I'll say it's complicated. There are no silver bullets. There are no villains. Yet there are pockets of solutions that exist in most communities. So solutions. One is sustained economic rival for low-paid workers. This is the number one solution through all the research and everything that I've uncovered. All other things being equal, income makes the biggest difference. A number of studies have validated that. Fortunately right now, wages are on the rise. That's good. Will it continue? I'm not sure. But one of the things I wonder is if going back into the 60s, if they would have indexed cost of living to something, and it had gone up proportionately, I just wonder how many of these problems that we have today wouldn't exist. The next one, restoring the norm of traditional marriage, including childbearing by design rather than default. I mentioned child care before, or center-based daycare and child care and preschool education, the importance that has in brain development for kids. More funding for schools with disproportionate number of students experiencing poverty. Fair is not necessarily equal. A lot of times we think fair is equal, and it really isn't. And then finally, as I mentioned before, one safe and stable adult makes a big difference in resiliency for kids. These are all larger systemic issues that are really, really difficult to do. So each one of us as individuals may not be able to impact each one of these. There are issues that we have to tackle on either a state or national basis. But what can you do? What can you do as an individual? I'll go through a few thoughts here. Number one, suspend judgment. Challenge yourself to suspend judgment, to let go of the stereotypes. Number two, seek to learn and understand. Read outside of your box, so to speak. I'd recommend two books for those of you who are readers. Our Kids, The American Dream in Crisis, It's a great book. And then the second one, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent. I mentioned that earlier. Both of these books, in some ways, can be hard to read. They can challenge your thinking in a lot of ways. And there are books that you do not have to agree with everything in order for it to really change how you think about some of the things that we have going on within society today. But if you like to read, again, highly recommend these two. But I'd ask you to read with an open mind and not with judgment. Number 3, to be an advocate for those in poverty. This is a core value we developed as a board several years ago, probably 6, 7 years ago. And where that came from was having been in a conversation with some peers, and disparaging comments were made about people in poverty. And at that point, I just kind of did a couple of uncomfortable chuckles, changed the topic, and we went on with things. And I thought later, well, that's not right. And so instead, we challenged ourselves, we challenged the board, use that as an opportunity to try to educate, to try to share with folks what the real issues are and how complicated it is. So be an advocate for those in poverty. Number 4, make it personal. Get involved somewhere. Volunteer for EPH, volunteer for St. John's, volunteer for Freedom House or Golden House, volunteer for somebody within the community. Once you start to see and experience it and it becomes personal, it becomes much more meaningful and it makes a difference. This next slide on making it personal, I'm not going to read this one. I'm just going to pause and let you read it silently and reflect on it just for a second. Let it speak to you in some way. And then I'd like to close again with that sentence from the Catholic social teachings, and those 2 words that I find so powerful. Those who are oppressed by poverty are the object of a preferential love by the church. And by the church, I'd like to interpret that as all of us. Excuse me. None of us are exempt from the opportunity or from providing or offering preferential love. Again, imagine a world where everyone portrayed preferential love. Thank you. Oh, no, my throat keeps trying out tonight. Now that I've finished yours, Father, I can start on another one.
You're going to give me the rest? Thank you, Dave. You packed a lot into that little half hour of stuff there. Appreciate that. Just a note that as we continue, if you're listening online live now this evening, Wednesday evening, November 10th, there's a chat box, an option to chat with us. So send it in and I'll get it on my phone, and you can have some input as well. As well as for the rest of you in church here. If you have any ideas, questions, concerns, please, we're open to you there. Tony loves to run around and get his steps in.
Well, one of the things that my name is Kitty Berry, and I have the
Give a little bit of your background a little bit. You've been working with...
Sure. I have the pleasure of serving on the EPH board as the representative from Resurrection Parish. I was also involved in 1992 when our parish was looking at EPH as a possible way for us to be more involved locally. So it's really a privilege for me to be part of this organization. One of the things that was meant, I've had the opportunity to listen to Dave at a retreat that he gave at our EPH board meeting, gave us many of these statistics, and I have the book, our children's, so if anybody's interested. One of the things that I noticed in there was that people who are currently living in poverty are not involved with religious communities. And
Are not what?
not involved with religious communities.
Okay.
We are a religious community.
Mhm.
Is there something we as community can do to reach out for that particular, in that particular area?
I was going to go, is there something wrong with us? Why is that true that people of poverty do not come in and celebrate and pray with?
I'm not sure I have an answer as to why, but in terms of what we can do, within our vision, one of the things we talk about is helping families experience wholeness. And we put the word wholeness in quotes because we really believe that when an individual is on a faith journey, they're much more likely to achieve self-sufficiency. They're much more likely to move forward. So yes, we encourage it. The case manager will talk to a family about their faith journey. If there's a desire, we have a bookshelf full of religious materials that they can pick from and take home. We also offer them the partnership church as most aligned with either the home that they're staying at or a denomination of their choice. So we do try to support that. But yet we still find a lot of families just aren't ready for it. Mm-hmm. Why? I'm not sure I have a good answer for that.
Right. Last week during Resurrection's Faith Formation Generations, we were talking about this particular social Catholic teaching, and so we had some breakout sessions, and I had the opportunity to show EPH has some wonderful videos on their website, so if you have a chance to go on and look at them. It was called A Day in the Life, and it doesn't have any words. I mean, you hear kids laughing, but there's really, the only word is that there are 12,000, the only thing you read is there are over 12,000 kids in Brown County who are homeless. And then it shows a day in the life of 2 or 3 children. So we showed this to parents and youth and asked the youth what was similar about the life that they lead and the life that they saw for these other kids. And they said, well, they still have to do their homework because they showed the kids doing their homework. However, it was in a restaurant. It wasn't at home. There wasn't a lot of support there. So we asked the kids, so how, when you were talking about judgment, how would you feel if you knew your classmate was a person who was living in poverty? And all the kids said, we'd be fine. It would be just fine. We wouldn't even probably notice, or, it wouldn't be a big deal. We need to treat everyone alike. Now, the parents, interestingly enough, said, I want to think that I'm going to be that kind of person that my child just said that they're going to be, but I'm not always sure that I am that person. And so you mentioned that about suspending judgment.
Suspending judgment, right.
And one of the things that I've worked in the community working with people with disabilities my whole career. So when Dave was talking about this, he said, we're talking about families who are experiencing homelessness. So I always talk about people with disabilities. So the first thing you hear is people, and the first thing you hear is families who are experiencing homelessness. And I think that that's very powerful for me to think of it in that particular light, because these are families. These are children of God, and yet they have very different experiences than my kids did, or my grandchildren.
Very different experiences, and if I can, I'll just spend a minute or two talking about words in a year. So, you just always continue to learn. When you're in this field, if you want to call it that, you're just learning all the time. And it's become more and more apparent to me how the words I use at times and how I use them may have a very different meaning to a person experiencing homelessness. I think I'm saying something that's okay, that's helpful, but yet on the receiving end, it could come across very, very differently. So I learned to try to choose my words more carefully within the context of that individual and what that individual is experiencing. So many misunderstandings just because of a different interpretation of a few words.
And standing up as an advocate, I think, is very, it's not always easy to do, but it's so critical because, as you say, words matter, and we need to be standing up for, advocating for, dispelling some of the misconceptions. So I really appreciate that also for something that we can do as a community.
I like to call them moments. And I'm remembering a time when a gentleman was sitting and came into church, and we knew he had some issues. And he came into church with his guitar, and he was dressed, it must have been like a fall, he had a few layers on. And he sat in the front pew, and he started to take his shirt off. And there were people in church going, and then he took another layer off, and then another layer off. And we're all going, how many layers does he have, and what is he going to, how far is this going to go? I also remember a time when somebody walked into church, and they had a little bit too short of a skirt on, and a little bit lower top on, and a gentleman with tattoos on, and somebody who wasn't speaking or acting as they should in church. And we know those moments are very judgmental, and they bring about a sense of a classed society, an expectation of, in the term of class in church, in who we are praying with. And maybe it speaks a little bit about why we are praying. Why is it that we come together? Is it so that we all look alike, act alike, that we are on the same, again, as you're talking about the caste system? Well, in our church, in our parish, this is the expectation. Now, you can go even within another Catholic situation or another denominational situation, and it can be very different. That the expectation is very different from one church situation to another. So when I hear about somebody who has been living in their car, has not had the opportunity to, oh, there's the other one, the other either too much perfume or this one has not bathed for a while, all kinds of judgments come up. And there, as you said, Dave, it's a word, it's a look, it's the staring as they're going down to communion and receiving the body of Christ in the Catholic Church situation, and it's like, how could they? And we do that all the time, and not just in church. You know, it happens in classrooms, it happens in the supermarket, it happens anywhere we go. We're looking, we're watching, what rank do they have? What do they deserve? And probably in the back of my mind often is, what did they do wrong? As you mentioned about people making decisions that are not helpful for their life, for their lifestyle, or for their children, or for advancing in society. And that to live within that seems to be very challenging. And I don't know, I'm on the side where I do a little once in a while too, and I was like, I don't know where to go with that. I mean, there's a part of me and a part of us that, from families to church and, you know, hearing sermons and preaching and teachings about you should do this and you shouldn't do this, and it all trickles down into my next reaction to something I see.
It is hard. For those of you who received emails from me, a verse that I have at the bottom of my emails that I've had for several years now is out of James 2, verse 13, mercy triumphs over judgment. And I do that for no other reason that if I've got that out of my email, it creates an expectation for me. Because I know it's something I have to work on all the time. Now, if I put that verse within the context of Catholic social teachings and what we mentioned before, you know, I just thought of this, but maybe you rewrite the verse. I shouldn't say that. You don't rewrite the Bible, but rewrite the verse.
We're Catholics, we do.
Preferential love triumphs over judgment. Think about that. Preferential love triumphs over judgment.
Right.
And those two words, have really resonated with me. So that was a learning opportunity for me in preparing and thinking about getting together and being with you this evening.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at scriptures, the whole development of Jesus as he moves from being born and into ministry into meeting up with individuals in society, it was all pushing against the norms of that time. You shouldn't eat with them. You shouldn't touch them. You shouldn't. All these things were happening, and it really, in my opinion anyway, it's what led him to being killed. That as they needed to get rid of that voice that said, they're as good and loving and caring and loved by God as you are. And that's not I worked hard for who I am. I worked hard for my life. I worked hard to be who I can be. You're going to tell me that this guy who hasn't worked in 15 years and lives out of his car and is a drug addict and everything else, and he's as good as I am in the eyes of God? Let's get rid of that message, right? And I think it's powerful when you use the word preferential, because it forces us to cut through our own judgments, our own lifestyles, our own need to be right. Our own sense that if I can do this, somebody else can do it as well. And when we look at the preferential love, preferential option for the poor, it takes down all those barriers, in my understanding.
And it goes both ways. I'll share kind of a personal story, an experience that I think further illustrates our movement towards more and more of a class society. So my wife and I felt like we were developing a pretty good relationship with a family that was just, getting by day in, day out. And we had this relationship for like 3-4 years. Watched the kids grow up a little bit. Tried to help mentor kids a little bit with school, but with some of the cognitive issues related to trauma and poverty, is quite a challenge. But then we came to a point where here my wife and I thought we were developing a good relationship, a trusting relationship, and they became uncomfortable with it. They became uncomfortable with the class difference between us. So it kind of goes both ways. They felt more comfortable moving into and being part of a neighborhood that was much closer and more similar to what they were than what they saw with my wife and I.
Right.
So we still reflect on that. We still wonder, gee, what else could we have done? How did it turn out this way? But that's just the way it is. That's just the way it went.
Yeah, just a real quick example. When I was in Dominican Republic, I went to a situation around the Haitian border that was poverty all over. And me being there, and there was mostly people of color, and I walk in as one of two Caucasian whites from the U.S., from the rich country of the United States. It was after a couple of years there, it was very uncomfortable for me to be in that situation for a number of reasons, but yeah, it's hard to cross those lines. And I forget where exactly I heard it, and I don't have the exact numbers and percentages, but pretty close, that the top 5% of the richest people in, I think it was the U.S., earn as much as, was it 50%, 60%? And the 70%, because the top 1% earn as much as the top 50%, or the bottom 50%. It was an incredible, I don't know the exact numbers there, but it was an incredible statement of how we're moving, and you've got the, those huge conglomerates of people and people happening because of technology, all the ones who are rich because of what they happen to invent in that moment, and all of a sudden they're catapulted into that society, that level of society, and the gaps that happen in there, and the responsibilities. We're looking at Facebook, the responsibility of Facebook. Somehow they have to be involved in every process that happens in our families, in our country, in our politics, in our economics, and all of a sudden it's all on that person or that organization to all of a sudden make decisions for the rest of us. It's phenomenal. I mean, the difference that has happened in the last, 10, 20 years, whatever, has really catapulted us into a whole different system of society that is, I find it kind of frightening on that level. How do we deal with that situation without going back to that basic idea of the preferential? Mm-hmm. If we lose that basis of why we do what we do, we're in trouble.
I was thinking about some of the things you were saying tonight, all three of you, with regard to people who are in poverty, families in poverty. You mentioned about the kind of myth of pulling things up by your bootstraps and getting going on your own, which we know really can't ever happen. Because people can't do it by themselves. They need the help of a village or a community. So direct services are wonderful, and we get a lot of support from churches and groups for direct service, but it doesn't change that people still are in poverty, because there are a lot of systemic issues that keep them there. So do you have any insights on the kinds of advocacy that needs to be done to change so that decisions that are made by those who are privileged aren't deepening the poverty for those who are without?
It's very, very complicated. Go back to just a couple of words in the video quick, and that's there are no villains. We got here over the course of 50 to 60 years, and I think it'd take a long time for us to dig our way out of this, so to speak. But I read something, recently, one of the daily devotionals that comes my way, and it differentiated between charity and justice. And the difference between, charity is what we can do with services to help each other, like you had mentioned, Sheila. Whereas justice is working to change the overall system that is contributing to poverty and homelessness in where we are today. I wish I could be more optimistic about that, but we have become so divisive as a country over the last several years that coming together for a solution for the common good just seems to be more and more difficult. And so I guess we start where we are, you know, one family at a time, one person at a time, trying to get ourselves and spread the word maybe even about the concept of preferential love and what that means. Maybe today that's the best that we can do. Because a lot of these things have to be solved at either a state or federal level in order to reverse some of the trends. And not to belabor the point, but I truly, truly believe that this is a crisis today. A crisis because of what I mentioned before, the impacts of trauma on childhood development and on brain development just lead to another generation of not having the full capacity to make the kind of decisions that allow you to escape that socioeconomic class, so to speak. And, you know, I'm not sure what else to say. It is complicated. It is a big challenge.
And it's hard, you know, when we look at legislative advocacy to invite people who have lived in poverty. Tech did a wonderful job telling her story. Why were you living in the car? You know, what else had happened? Do legislators, does the certain laws, do we think about how it will impact families and people who are living in poverty? So I don't know that everyone thinks that particular way about legislation.
And we won't know until we ask for their stories.
Yeah.
Until we listen.
Again, it's not there's no magic bullet. It's just a series of things that have to kind of come together before. As you know, several authors, I mean, if you read a lot of literature, a lot of books on this, they're all very, very consistent. And they all deal with, you know, a more of affordable living wage for folks, being able to make progress there, to be able to have quality childhood education and opportunities, especially in that age category of 3 to 5 years old. To going back to something you mentioned before, Kitty, to somehow bring about some of the old. I shouldn't say old, that's a bad way to say it, but the traditional values of getting married first and then having kids versus, you know, having kids. So there are just a lot of things that all would need to come together, and it might take a couple generations to be able to do that.
Well, one of the things that, as you're talking, is one of the things that I can do, and that, you know, I'm far from a model on this one, but I choose not to do Facebook. You know, and I think there's a lot of divisiveness in there, and I originally thought, who am I going to tell, who am I going to defriend, or whatever you call it? So who am I going to kick out because I don't like them anymore? You know, and it just sets you up, it seems. But anyway, how I choose to be a consumer, what I choose to the type of, for example, if I buy a new sweater, am I buying it for a week? Or am I buying it for a year? If we're going to raise the minimum wage, am I willing to let go of not necessarily having the top fashion or be in the top trendy restaurants, or to have the finest car on the block? You know, am I willing to live with what I need more than what I desire, more than what I want in the moment? And I think in our culture, we're caught up into that whole sense of, if I have the money, I can do it. You know, instead of dealing with some of the systemic issues, I can't do anything about that. I'm just going to do what I can do, and I'm just going to make my life comfortable, and more comfortable, and more comfortable. You know, so I think a lot of it, how we produce things in the country and the world depends on how we consume. And each individual has a huge voice in saying what I'm going to buy and what I'm not going to buy, where I'm going to live and where I'm not going to live, how I'm going to treat my neighbor or not treat my neighbor. And as a whole, that's where the preferential comes in. How do I prefer? What are the preferences that I see in that person? I see the dignity in that person. Can I treat them with dignity, dignified, and able to give life rather than take life or take it away? So I think a lot of it is systemic, but systemic is very close many times to what I can do and what I do in my personal life. You want to jump in?
Well, maybe.
Couple more minutes, then we're going to close it out here.
Okay. This was going to make it down to not systemic, but more practical. I was just wondering, as you talked about generational poverty, and we've seen how people, I've known families that don't have the background. They didn't grow up with it, with some of the things that we just assume you put the garbage out. We assume that you're going to clean the bathrooms, but maybe they didn't live in that kind of a setting where that was just a given. So the givens aren't there. So are there mentoring for people who go through EPH? This is very specific now, that help folks learn some of those things, that silverware is the same as knives and forks?
That's a good question. We actually talked about that a little bit in a different context at our board meeting today. And we have struggled to get a really good mentoring program going. With the families that we're working with, some of these families have sometimes 5 and 6 different, let's call them social workers that they're working with. They might be working with a school social worker, with the kids. They might be working with a McKinney-Vento individual. They may have an individual with forward services that they're working with on employment-related issues. There might be a CPS, Child Protective Services, involved. So you can kind of keep going, and some of these moms already are having to report into, so to speak, at least their perception, report into 4 or 5 different individuals that are done in a loving, constructive way, but yet the accumulation of everything, when you say, can we help you, can we provide a mentor in a particular life skill, their reaction is, I've got enough people in my life telling me what to do right now, I don't need one more. Mm-hmm. So that's been really difficult for us to effectively get going.
I like what you said on the young woman said. She said they were able to trust me with what I needed in the moment so that I can now trust myself and my kids can trust me. So it's as much as mentoring as it is giving people the opportunity to find themselves to be, again, dignified, trustworthy, and able to make good decisions, better decisions in their life. So,
Dave, you talked about doing what you can right in front of you, starting where you're planted, right? At Res here, we've been talking a bit about having families that belong here, worship here, have dinners with people who are being helped by EPH. But one of the struggles or the challenges I think that we're kind of running into is how do we make that not be an us versus, or us and them? That it's families coming together, not the Res family having dinner with the EPH family. Mm-hmm. And I was struck by, the silverware story, but also by you and your wife and the families and sometimes the disconnect. So any practical tips about how this parish might pull that off so that it becomes just families dining with families and not this classification and that classification, which I think just permeates the whole divide.
Mm-hmm. It's difficult. I'll add one more barrier to that when you're trying to arrange and set up things like that is most of these families have so many things going on, within their lives, especially your single parent moms, getting their kids places and maintaining their employment and trying to work on their education. And a lot of times what we find is they have good intentions and they'll say, sure, I'll do that on a Friday night. Well, you get to Friday night and they're not there. Well, a kid got sick, got called into, a different shift at work, or my car didn't start, or so many things happen. Those things become very, very difficult. One thing that we did up until COVID, we stopped because of COVID, but I think we did it 3 years in a row, and it was pretty successful. In fact, we did it here at Resurrection. We had a Christmas dinner. And the advantage of doing it that way is the dinner was for many of the families. So I got the feeling they felt very comfortable with each other, being all having, part of the EPH family, so to speak. And then we were the servers. EPH, board members, volunteers would be serving the families. That, I think, went pretty well. The exception being, kind of what I just mentioned, is we'd have 20 families that say, yeah, this is a great idea, I'd love to be there, and then we'd have 10 show up for all the reasons that I mentioned, the stuff that gets in the way of life for them. But yes, to do one-on-one is quite a challenge.
Any last comments from any of you out there? I don't have any more chats coming in. Any last impressions that what you've take away from tonight, Kitty? Dave?
Well, it's complicated. It is just very, very complicated, and we can move forward one step at a time. Not to be too redundant, but another thing that I've come to maybe appreciate much more over the last few years. One of those things you're taught as a kid, but I don't know, maybe you have to get older to really appreciate it. And that's the value of the Great Commission. I mean, that's what it's all about. Love God, love your neighbor. Preferential love. It all boils down to that.
Well, we've appreciated the opportunity to be part of EPH and the work that you've done, and we know it's not the end solution, but we've appreciated as a parish our opportunities to be part of EPH and helping families move to the next level. So we want to continue that partnership and appreciate what you do there to keep us moving forward.
Thank you, Kitty.
The way you do that
Father.
there again and again and again, it seems.
Yeah.
You're back again. Yeah. But I think, again, it's with the housing shortage in the Green Bay area and the need for just having people giving the opportunity to have a roof over their head and to take that next step from transitional to a longer term to, it's a huge service and a beautiful way to love and care for our neighbors. So we can be a part of the solution as we continue to move forward. So, good. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, everybody.
Great conversation and a wonderful opportunity. Yeah, thank you all for